Welcome to Week 9, Introduction to Psychology 1. We're going to look at the second part of memory, and this might be the part that you're most familiar with, really. And yet it might be a bit useful for you in this particular chapter. We're going to look at what is the concept of remembering. How do we measure remembering? We're also going to be looking at some of the features that affect our remembering. Position, serial or recency positioning, or whether it involves state, emotional state or environmental state memory. But then we're also going to look at forgetting. Why do I forget? What are the things that affect why I forget some things when they're things that I really might want to remember? And then the last little part of this particular part, we're going to look a lot about how do we improve our memory. Now the part to really remember here, and I'll try to emphasize this, is that in this part about how to improve, this is based on research. This is not, somebody saying this is what works best, trust me. This is a lot based on the research that's been done that helps people facilitate better memory, better ways of remembering information that's important. So please pay attention to that section. You may find some very useful strategies to help you do a better job of remembering things that are important to you. All right, so good luck, and I hope you enjoy this particular chapter.
Well, to begin, let's look at measuring memory, and in particular here we're just going to look at how do we just use our memory. So we're going to begin with recall. Now recall requires that we can retrieve information from our memory without the benefit of any kind of cue. Now what I mean by a cue is a prompt. So for example, if I were to ask you the question, who was the founder of operant conditioning theory? Now, if you were able to respond with B.F. Skinner, then you didn't need any cue, you just popped it out. So generally, recall would be things that we can just recall things without any prompts or cues. So your family members' names, maybe a speech that you gave a while ago, you can probably give it again without a whole lot of prompts. You just go bang, way you go, or sing a song that you've sang lots of times before, or stuff about your personal information. So you don't need prompts for that. No one has to tell me, what's your brother's name? The guy that was born after you, who's the same height as you? I don't need any prompts. I know exactly who he is, and I can just pop it out there, no problem at all. So that's recall. Now, alternatively, we have what's called recognition. And recognition would be something that requires us to have some sort of previous information or having had an encounter with it before, and we need a prompt sometimes. So for example, if I asked you a question like, B.F. Skinner was the founder of operant condition theory, true or false? Well, now I've given you information, you'd recognize, oh yes, he is, and you'd go true. Now sometimes I might use a retrieval cue, giving hints about the information that's required. So for example, that question might be, the founder of operant conditioning was B.F., and leave you with a blank to fill in the rest. Now the BF may have been a cue for you to put in Skinner. Now when we use recognition, sometimes we use different strategies, and I'll go into more strategies later on. And one example of a recognition strategy would be using a mnemonic. And again, I'll go into this later on. Now another strategy or another way of measuring is what's called relearning, and this is the process of studying information that a person has already learned to some degree in the past. So this is where you're preparing for a final exam, and you're going back over information that you've already been, learning and putting to long-term memory. So now you're basically relearning. And then retention is expressed as the percentage of time spent saved when material is relearned. So the more you have held on to stuff that you're relearning is what you've retained, or your retention rate. Okay, now let's look at the nature of remembering. And when we think of, memory as somewhat of a permanent record, now I say somewhat, is that you can certainly have different conditions where memory decays, that we don't have it all totally there as a permanent record. It's not as likely. There's a belief that we have this total memory of everything. It's kind of like a video camera recording, analogous to that, and it's arguable that it's not quite as reliable at that. In fact, there's a lot of research that talks about, you know, creating false memories, that we can actually create things that we absolutely believe occurred to us in the past that did not happen in the past. So there's some question as to the permanence of memory and the solidity of a permanent record. But memory is, it can be also seen as a reconstruction, that it's partly fact and partly fiction. We often reconstruct our memories, piecing them together, highlights with information that may or may not be completely accurate. And so this whole notion of memory being fully factual, and we might argue with family members about how things occurred in the order in which they occurred, really just reminds us that we don't all have all the facts of memory, that in fact there's an element of it that's been reconstructed. Now there's a term that's used in memory and in learning, it's called schema. And schemas are the framework of knowledge or the assumptions that we have about people, about objects, about events, and that we can encode and recall information according to these schemas. So schemas are kind of like pre-existing mental concepts that when I think of mammals, I have a preconceived mental concept about who and what gets included in the schema of mammals. I know it ranges from mice, it can include humans, monkeys, elephants, and I can sort of see this all fits within the same mental concept. That I don't include fish in mammals. That's a different schema. And so this framework of knowledge, these assumptions we make about the world around us, helps us remember some elements, in the world around us by these pre-existing mental concepts. So let's look at some more about memory. When we think about memory, we also have about remembering. And one form is what's called flashbulb memories. These are very vivid, and the memories that tend to be connected and tied to emotion. They're extremely vivid memories of conditions surrounding one's first hearing of the news, for example, that are things that are surprising, shocking, or highly emotional events. Perhaps you have a very emotional memory of a death or injury of a family member or a friend. News that is of a catastrophic degree, the 911 events, the explosion of the Challenger space shuttle and the people who were killed in that. We have recall of these events because of the high emotionality and the high consequentiality of the event, the importance of the consequence in the events. And we rehearse them. Often how people think about these events afterwards can affect the degree of emotionality to them. Our eyewitness events can have a huge impact on flashbulb memories in terms of what we've witnessed and the circumstances in which we've remembered them. They may not be as accurate as people believe they are, mind you, because again, we can manufacture and alter some of those memories. Researchers have also found that some of the details in flashbulb memories can change over time. Now, another form of memory is eidetic memory. This is also known as photographic memory, and it's very highly developed learning and very specific learning strategies. Now, the person you're seeing there in the image on the left is Stephen Whitshire. And Stephen has an eidetic memory in regards to visual content. And what you're seeing is there are examples of drawings that he's made by virtue of witnessing something for the first time and only time. They take him up in a helicopter over cities, and then for the next 5 or 6 days, he draws a detailed replication of what he's seen, and they've demonstrated to be particularly accurate. Now, photographic memory or eidetic memory appears to exist in about 5% of people. In Stephen's case, he has a savant condition, so there's a particularly high skill level in a limited area. And it's more common among children than it is among adults. Now, let's look at some of the effects about how we remember and things that affect that process. Now, we're going to look at what's called serial position effect. And I'll put them both up there. We have primacy effect and recency effect. The serial position effect is the tendency to remember the first and the last bits of information more accurately than the middle items in a sequence of information. So the tendency to remember the beginning series is called primacy effect, and the recency effect is the tendency to remember information which is most recently exposed to, or the last part. Primacy effect information at the beginning of the sequence is likely to be recalled because it's already in place in long-term memory. Therefore, rehearsal is useful to improve memory. So the primacy, often when we hear the first piece, we try to remember it, and in the process of rehearsal, the middle piece is a little muddy and we may not even hear the second piece or the last piece. Whereas recency effect, the information at the end of the sequence has a higher probability of being recalled because it's still in the short-term memory and therefore is being rehearsed. So poor recall of information in the middle of a series is because it's no longer in short-term memory. It's been displaced. Serial position effect supports the notion of separate systems of short and long-term memory. Without this primacy and recency effect in a short-term memory component, everything would get into long-term memory, and it doesn't. So this demonstrates that there's two parts of memory in terms of short-term memory and long-term memory. Sometimes we have what's called text and state-dependent memories. And what's important here to recognize is that sometimes the context-dependent memory is information that's easier to recall when a person is in the same environmental context that they were in when they were learning it. So memories are often tied to the setting in which they occur, and returning to such a setting can trigger the retrieval of that context-linked memory. And so there are times when perhaps the way that you study, and you really seem to have a good handle on it in how you study, and then you go into a classroom to do the test and you find that it's not the same context as where you studied in, which is maybe to explain where some of that memory doesn't come right back to you. So it may be appropriate at times to study in a more text-dependent sort of relationship, is one way to consider it. Now there is another version other than context-dependent, is state-dependent. And state-dependent is the information is easier to recall when a person is in the same emotional state when they were learning it. Students exposed to a spider and or snakes while they were learning a list of words have a tendency to recall those words better when those creatures are present during recall. Now, you could sort of determine that, or could try to create a comfortable setting in your home, say, to study, and then bring some of those things that can be innocuous to the exam and place them in front of you. You know, some jelly beans that you have at your home, you bring them. Those could help bring a more state-dependent memory recall, perhaps. Depressed adults recall more negative life experiences. It's because that state of depression brings about a lot of thoughts about negativity, so they have a tendency to remember more negative life experiences. They're more likely to recall parents as unloving or as rejecting. Depression can, in fact, impair memories. Younger depressed patients often experience are more impaired as they become older in terms of their remembering of negative things, and negative recall tendency reverses itself when depression lifts. Now, we've talked so far about things about remembering, but of course, we do forget things. So what are the reasons that we might be forgetting some things? Oh, sorry, let's just quickly, there's your reminder in terms of operations of encoding and operations of retrieval. These sometimes overlap in terms of retrieval success in regards to context and state dependent. The operations in which you encode, context or state, can impact the operations at retrieval. So in terms of forgetting causes, well, one of the main ones is encoding failure. We just never got the information into long-term memory. We didn't work with it. We didn't rehearse it. We didn't practice. We didn't do the things we needed to do to encode correctly in short term to bring it into long-term memory, is one of the most notable reasons for forgetting. Now, there is another and this is often called decay theory, and it's based on the neurochemical memory trace. That is, if it's not rehearsed, the neuromedical path decays, it weakens. And so it's kind of like a muscle memory is. The more you practice things, the stronger that muscle becomes, or in this case, the stronger the neurochemical connections become. And if you don't practice, then those neurochemical traces get weakened and thus disconnect or not strong enough to pull out the accurate, reliable memory. Now there's another source of forgetting. It's called interference. And interference is what you might think is that information interferes with each other. There's proactive interference and retroactive interference. Now, proactive interference is the first learned in effect, and the second interferes with it. Whereas the retroactive, it's the second that interferes with the first. So either the first interferes with the second, proactive, or the second interferes with the first, retroactive. And it's important to sort of take things in smaller chunks so that we don't get this interference based on one thing interfering with the other thing. It's that when that's happening, we're trying to swallow too much. We need to chunk it down into smaller pieces and rehearse the smaller pieces and then connect them with one another. Now, one of the other features is what's called consolidation failure. And this is not something that students normally experience, but consolidation failure as to why we don't remember something is that it's due to injury. If you lose consciousness while you're learning something, you stop learning as soon as you lose consciousness. And when you wake up, whatever you were exposed to while unconscious, you will not have recall of. That just makes sense. So that's one reason that we forget, but that's not typically, as a student at least, why you might be forgetting. Now, there is also something that's called motivated forgetting. Motivated forgetting is a means of protecting yourself from painful or unpleasant memories. It's sometimes involving suppression or repression of memories. Now, to be involved in repression, it's a type of motivated forgetting in which individuals completely remove information from consciousness, removing memories of painful events from consciousness. Now, that can be a good thing for some people, not to have that memory reappearing frequently and causing grief and and emotional turmoil regularly. Now, there is another form of motivated forgetting that's in part through motivation. Other times it's through injury, but amnesia. This is the partial or complete loss of memory due to a loss of consciousness, brain damage, or psychological cause. Now, there are many ways to improve memory, and I'm only going to go through some of them here. So to improve memory, you could be using strategies of active learning. Active learning is the connecting of new information to that which you already know, and it's an active process. So it's looking at existing and new information and linking it to previously learned information. And so this is the chunking, moving things from small into bigger and bigger and bigger by linking them, and that's an active process of learning. You could use organizational skills or using categories or mnemonics. You'll find mnemonics to be very helpful. I'll post a video on that and put it in this week 9 for you to give you an idea what that could look like. In fact, I think that's going to be in your journal for week 8, which now, as you know, has opened early. And so organization is about utilizing different ways to categorize, organize, and make sense of information, whether it be in smaller pieces, whether it be by classifying information, or whether it be in terms of some other means of organizing that information to make it more palatable and more understandable. You can also use what's called overlearning. Now, to some degree, this is practicing and studying material beyond the point where you can just repeat it once without error. Sometimes what we do is we practice and we rehearse until we can repeat the material sequentially in order correctly once. But overlearning is to be able to do it more than once. People remember material better and longer if they overlearn it. And you're probably familiar with massed practice. You may not be as familiar with spaced practice. When you look at mass practice, this is where you sit down for long periods of practice sessions and try to get as much in a sit down. You know, you're cramming is what you're doing. And research doesn't support that this is a very reliable way to learn. Spaced practice, on the other hand, is learning in short practice sessions and rest periods in between. So it's more effective with learning than mass practice because it gives you a rest period to consolidate information. It applies to motor skills. You can do better by having spaced practice than mass practice for motor skills, learning facts, or any other sort of information. So you may want to take advantage of that as a resource. Now, how is information stored? Well, one of the first things we do is we perceive information. So we take the information in and we have to process that information by putting it into short-term memory. We do that through rehearsal. Now we want to be rehearsing things in small chunks so as not to have interference or decay. We want to be rehearsing enough where decay doesn't take hold. So we want to perceive information, put it into our the specific information we need to learn to put it into short-term memory. We want to take any of the meaningful information from short-term memory into long-term memory, because short-term memory is just that, short, and if we rehearse it and chunk it correctly and organize our information, we can put it into long-term memory so it can be later retrieved. Anything that we don't need, we do a brain dump. Unimportant stuff is dumped. So when we don't pay attention to information in our short-term memory, that is the information that we perceive, if we don't pay close enough attention to it, it doesn't get into short-term memory very well, so we start to dump important information there. And if it doesn't get into long-term memory, we've dumped some very important information there as well. So making information easier to retrieve, and some of these I've used before, but relaxing and using 5-5-5 is a strategy that I've encouraged people to try from time to time. It's about getting yourself in a more relaxed state, whether it is in the putting the information in or pulling the information out. 5-5-5 is a breathing technique. And so what you would do is you would inhale slowly to the count of 5, hold your breath for a count of 5, and then exhale to the count of 5 and repeat that 5 times. Now there's a few things you're doing with that. One is you're slowing your breathing down and you're getting full capacity of oxygen to your brain. And that just really enables you to sort of oxygenate the blood going into your brain, which is a very good physiological thing. The other thing you're doing is when you're counting 5, 5, 5, is you're distracting your mind from other things that are distracting you. It allows you to focus and relax. It's a good strategy to get yourself ready to take in information. Now, in addition, make information meaningful. The more that you can connect what you're learning to what it is that is meaningful to you, the easier it is to learn. So in psychology, all of this information relates to you. You are meaningful. Connect what you're learning to you individually, whether in this case it's memory, so how do I learn better, and what circumstances do I have to remember, and when do I use my memory, and how can I use this information, and how does it become meaningful to me? So find ways to make what information you're learning meaningful. Making more associations is just about making more connections to things that you know, things that you've learned. Make associations, and that is in terms of when you're learning this, connect it to the stuff that you've learned previously so that you can make the association, you can have it joined together, if you will. So now you start to chunk these things together, link them together. They become bigger chains of understanding and memory. And then, of course, this has been mentioned several times, but practice increases access and the speed of retrieval. Rehearsal, rehearsal, rehearsal. You can't accelerate memory. You can really just take the time, space out your practices, and rehearse and get to the point of being able to rehearse to perfection on more than one occasion. So some additional meaningful techniques. When you're learning something, paraphrase the information into your own words. This helps you understand things in a more meaningful way to you. And by rephrasing them, it starts to encourage a link between short-term memory and long-term memory and putting things in a more organized, cataloged way in long-term memory so that you can retrieve them more easily when you need them. Mind mapping is a visual way of putting content into organized, connected ways. You can go down to Student Services and ask for some information about mind mapping. It is a strategy that visual learners can really take advantage of. Focus on structure rather than details. What's being encouraged when you do this is focus on the concepts and then fill in the concepts with more detail. It is sometimes easier to chunk down than to chunk up. Chunking up means looking at all the details and then try to find out what the local structures are. Now, for some people, that's the preferred way and the way that gets the information to them best. You need to know what works best for you to make information meaningful. For some of the visual learners, again, using tables, using flowcharts are good ways to make information that's comprehensive and big more understandable. It's a visual technique. And then lastly, and some of you I've seen use this, is discussing. So meeting and discussing about content can sometimes be very good ways to make more sense of information that you're trying to learn is by discussing with others and getting their perspective on it as well. Well, I hope this has been helpful, and I hope you can take advantage of this to help you with your studies. Alrighty then, have a good day.